You've probably eaten raw fish without a second thought. Sushi, sashimi, straight off the plate. Here's the uncomfortable part. Raw chicken sitting right next to it would make your stomach turn instantly, even though both are technically raw animal flesh. The reason has almost nothing to do with fish being cleaner, and everything to do with how closely related that animal is to you. So let's actually ask the question properly. Why does eating a slice of raw tuna feel like a completely normal, even sophisticated dining choice, while eating a slice of raw chicken feels like a genuine medical emergency waiting to happen? Because the honest answer isn't that fish is inherently safer as a broad category, or that meat is inherently more dangerous. It's a specific, measurable biological principle governing exactly which pathogens can successfully jump from an animal's body into yours, and that principle has almost nothing to do with which food group something technically belongs to. Let's start with the concept that explains most of what follows, something researchers studying disease transmission call phylogenetic distance, essentially a measure of how closely related two species are on the evolutionary tree of life. This concept matters enormously for food safety because pathogens, bacteria, viruses, and parasites alike are generally specialists rather than generalists. A pathogen that has spent millions of years evolving specifically to thrive inside one particular host species' body temperature, immune environment, and cellular chemistry doesn't automatically transfer that same effectiveness to a completely different species, especially one separated by an enormous evolutionary gap. The more closely related two species are, the more biologically similar their internal environments tend to be, and the easier it becomes for a pathogen adapted to one of them to successfully establish itself in the other. This is precisely why raw chicken and raw pork carry such elevated risk compared to raw fish. Chickens and pigs are both warm-blooded animals running at body temperatures relatively close to your own, and bacteria like Salmonella, Campylobacter, and E. coli, the organisms most commonly associated with foodborne illness from poultry and pork, evolved specifically within warm-blooded mammalian and avian gut environments. Your gut is also warm. Your body temperature sits comfortably within the range these bacteria are already built to thrive in, which means a bacterial population perfectly adapted to living inside a chicken or a pig finds remarkably little biological resistance when it ends up inside a human digestive tract instead. The pathogen doesn't need to adapt much at all because the internal environment it's moving into is already close enough to what it evolved for. Fish present a dramatically different picture, and the reason comes down to a genuinely enormous evolutionary gap. Researchers studying vertebrate evolutionary history placed the divergence between fish and the lineage that eventually led to mammals at an almost unimaginably distant point in evolutionary time, hundreds of millions of years before humans, chickens, or pigs existed in anything resembling their current form. A cold water fish like cod or salmon hosts a microbial population specifically adapted to survive in a consistently cold, aquatic environment, an internal chemistry and temperature range that looks almost nothing like the warm, oxygen-rich 37-degree environment inside a human digestive tract. Bacteria that have spent countless generations optimizing for cold water survival generally lack the specific adaptations needed to thrive once they're suddenly dropped into a dramatically warmer, biologically unfamiliar human gut, which is a major part of why raw fish, despite still being raw animal tissue, carries meaningfully lower bacterial risk in this specific sense compared to raw poultry or pork. It's worth being precise here, because raw fish isn't risk-free, and the specific risk it does carry reinforces the same underlying pattern rather than contradicting it. The primary concern with raw fish isn't bacterial contamination in the way it is with poultry, it's parasites, specifically roundworms like anisakis that can live in the muscle tissue of certain fish species. This is a genuinely real risk, capable of causing significant gastrointestinal illness if consumed alive. However, this particular risk has a remarkably simple, well-established solution: freezing. Regulatory food safety standards in many countries specifically require fish intended for raw consumption to undergo a specific freezing process beforehand, precisely because sustained freezing reliably kills these parasites before the fish ever reaches a plate. This is exactly why properly prepared sushi-grade fish carries such a low, real-world risk profile in practice. The danger was never really about the fish being fundamentally unsafe. It was about a specific, well-understood, and easily neutralized parasite risk, addressed through a straightforward industrial process most consumers never even think about. This raises a genuinely interesting comparative question worth exploring directly. Why pork specifically carries such a strong historical reputation for danger when eaten raw, even compared to other mammalian meat? The answer connects directly back to phylogenetic distance, but with an additional layer worth understanding. Pigs are mammals with digestive and physiological systems that share meaningful biological similarity to human systems, closer in several relevant respects than the similarity between humans and many other commonly farmed animals. Historically, this closer biological relationship made certain pathogens, trichinella parasites responsible for trichinosis, being the most well-documented example, particularly effective at establishing themselves in humans after consuming undercooked pork. Modern commercial farming practices, feed regulation, and inspection standards have dramatically reduced trichinosis rates in most developed food systems today, but the deep cultural caution surrounding raw pork that developed over centuries reflects a genuinely accurate historical read on a real, measurable biological risk, one directly tied to how biologically close pigs sit to humans on the evolutionary tree. Beef occupies a genuinely interesting middle position in this entire picture, and examining why helps clarify the underlying principle even further. Cattle are mammals, meaning some baseline phylogenetic distance risk applies, but the specific pathogens most commonly associated with raw beef, certain E. coli strains in particular, tend to be more localized to specific parts of the animal during processing, rather than distributed as thoroughly throughout the muscle tissue the way some other risks present. This is part of why dishes like steak tartare and beef carpaccio have existed as legitimate, long-standing culinary traditions across multiple cultures, while raw chicken and raw pork have essentially never developed equivalent mainstream culinary traditions in the same way. The risk with beef is real and specific enough to require careful sourcing and preparation, but it's meaningfully different in character and location from the more generalized bacterial contamination risk associated with poultry. There's a genuinely fascinating extreme case worth examining here because it illustrates exactly how far this phylogenetic distance principle extends when taken to its logical conclusion: primate meat consumption. Researchers studying zoonotic disease transmission, diseases that jump from animals to humans, have identified bushmeat consumption involving primates like chimpanzees as an unusually high-risk category specifically because of just how biologically close primates are to humans on the evolutionary tree. This isn't a purely theoretical concern either. Researchers studying the origins of HIV have traced the virus's jump into the human population back to contact with infected primate blood and tissue, a genuinely serious real-world consequence of consuming meat from an animal species close enough to humans that a pathogen faced remarkably little biological barrier in making that specific jump. This extreme example reinforces the broader pattern in the starkest possible terms. The closer an animal sits to humans on the evolutionary tree, the more dangerous that gap crossing becomes when a pathogen gets the opportunity to attempt it. It's worth addressing directly why this pattern isn't purely a fixed universal biological law, because temperature and environment add a genuinely important additional variable worth understanding. Arctic and subarctic communities have long traditions of consuming raw or minimally processed meat from mammals considerably more closely related to humans than fish are, seal, whale, and caribou among them. Foods that, based purely on phylogenetic distance, might seem like they should carry elevated risk similar to raw pork or beef. Researchers studying these traditional food practices have found that the specific environmental conditions these animals live in play a genuinely significant mitigating role. Animals living their entire lives in consistently near-freezing environments tend to host bacterial populations shaped by that same cold-adapted pressure, similar in principle to the fish situation we already covered, regardless of how closely related that mammal happens to be to humans genetically. This demonstrates that phylogenetic distance and environmental temperature both function as independent, meaningfully important variables in this same underlying risk calculation, rather than either one alone fully determining the outcome on its own. This connects to something genuinely important about how food-related disgust and caution actually develop within human cultures. Because the pattern isn't hardwired the same way an instinctive reaction to obviously spoiled food is. Researchers studying the psychology of food disgust have found that aversions to specific raw foods tend to be culturally learned and regionally specific rather than universal, shaped heavily by a given community's particular historical experience with foodborne illness outbreaks tied to specific foods. A culture that experienced serious, repeated outbreaks tied to a particular raw food source tends to develop strong, generationally reinforced caution around that specific food. Caution that can persist for generations even after modern food safety regulation has substantially reduced the actual underlying risk. This helps explain why raw fish consumption feels completely unremarkable in cultures with a long, successful history of eating it safely, while raw poultry consumption remains almost universally avoided avoid it in cultures with more recent, more visible experience with poultry-related bacterial outbreaks specifically. There's also a genuinely important modern food safety infrastructure angle worth drawing out here because it reinforces just how directly this underlying biological principle continues to shape practical, real-world food regulation today. Modern regulatory standards around raw fish specifically target the parasite risk we already discussed, mandatory freezing protocols, precisely because that's the specific, identifiable risk phylogenetic distance leaves genuinely present even after bacterial risk drops off dramatically. Modern regulatory and culinary standards around raw beef, by contrast, focus heavily on careful sourcing, trusted supply chains, and specific cuts less prone to surface contamination, addressing that meat's more specific, more localized bacterial risk profile. And modern food safety guidance around poultry remains, essentially universally, built around thorough cooking rather than any raw preparation pathway at all, precisely because the underlying bacterial risk from a phylogenetically close, warm-blooded source remains too broadly distributed and too effective at establishing itself in human physiology to meaningfully mitigate any other way. So the picture that emerges here isn't really about fish being some kind of uniquely safe food category, while meat represents a uniquely dangerous one. It's about an extraordinarily consistent underlying biological principle, how closely related a source animal is to humans, combined with the specific environmental conditions that animal lived in, determining how effectively any given pathogen can successfully make the jump from that animal's body into yours. Raw fish sits at one meaningful extreme of this spectrum specifically because of its enormous evolutionary distance from humans. Raw primate meat sits at the genuinely dangerous opposite extreme specifically because of its minimal evolutionary distance. And raw chicken, pork, and beef each occupy their own specific, measurably different points along that same continuous spectrum, shaped by exactly how closely related they are to you and exactly what kind of environment shaped the pathogens living inside them. So the next time you order sushi without hesitation while the idea of raw chicken makes you genuinely uneasy, it's worth recognizing that your gut reaction isn't some arbitrary cultural preference or inconsistent double standard. It's tracking something real and specific, a genuine measure of evolutionary distance quietly running beneath a decision that feels on the surface like nothing more than a simple preference between two different kinds of raw meat.